Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. I am Abe with MysticGenMara.com, a small town mystic from the middle of Idaho. And tonight we will be going back to our Occult'n'Crochet series. And before we get into our person, I do have updates on my current crochet project. I'd finished it finally, and this will be going up this week on my website, linked in the description. But it is a full skull shawl from fiery orange to almost black, and you can see the color change from very bright to very dark, and it looks a lot like an ember. Like if you ever see a campfire, there's always the dark bright or the bright orange that fades out to the more black, and that's where we got our color scheme here. So that is completed finally. I haven't talked too much with the crochet stuff, but that one has been one that I've been working on for a minute just because I like the pattern. It's just very time consuming. So I do have a couple of other things I'm going to be starting here shortly that are a little bit quicker, just for stuff to talk about, and then also to update some things on my website. But that one I wanted to show you because I've been talking about it for a little bit. So now on to the occult part. If you're new here, please hit that subscribe button, drop a like on the video if you enjoy this type of content, and let me know in the live chat, or if you're watching on replay, comment away and let me know what you think. I'm gonna go over, I'm dividing this gentleman into two parts for a reason. This is what my opinion is the modern day father of Wicca or witchcraft, and that is Gerald Gardner. We met the king and queen of the witches, Alex and Maxine Sanders, but let's go back a little bit further to how those two even got to where they were. They started a lot from what Gerald began. The reason I'm breaking this up into two parts is his history before he even started into the more intense aspects of the occult is vast, and I feel, as I've done with some of the other people, that the history of how he got where he was is important so that you understand more about the person, not just, well, he did this kind of witchcraft. You're right, he did, but this is why. So what I wanted to do with him, and I've done this with Israel Regardie and a few of the other ones. Regardie wasn't so much explaining life, it was the fact that he had so much of it. Gerald, I wanted to break today's up into pre-Wicca, pre-intense magical study, and then post-Wicca magic study. So next week, I believe, because this is the 5th week in January and next week's the 1st week in February, and the 5th week of the month is dealer's choice, so I figured we'll do one this week and do one next week, so they're together-ish for you guys. But I wanted to go over kind of the boring, so to speak, history of Gerald Gardner and give you a little bit of an idea of the type of person he was before we move into, like I said, why a lot of people, including myself, see him as the father of modern day witchcraft or Wicca, depending on, really, with him it's how you choose to believe, but we'll get into that. And I have a nice little tea here. It's a tropical mango pineapple, a little bit of marigold in there, very sweet, a little fruity. Not very far from home here, but we'll get started with Occult'n'Crochet on Gerald Gardner. Gerald Brosseau Gardner was born June 13th of 1884. He was born to an not starting off great tonight. He was born to an upper middle class family. His parents were classified as wealthy. His family owned a private timber company at the time, and this company was called Joseph Gardner and Sons. Their specialty? Importing hardwoods from what I could find all over the world. They were kind of like they would bring in the fancy woods for the floors, for the furniture, for the staircases, things like that. So, kind of cool, really. Gerald's father was William Robert Gardner, the youngest of Joseph Gardner and Sons. Joseph had 5 sons, and William was the youngest. Joseph also had 3 daughters, but we're not getting that far into family history because that's a whole different realm of history or a biography, and we're not going that route. William was dispatched to the United States at one point to expand the family business and, family interests, see if you can get some new buyers, things like that. And he did expand the business, and he expanded the family. He met Louise, this name was a difficult one to say, Bergalow Ennis, and they would be married in November of 1868. So he expanded the family and maybe some interests. The newly married couple would visit England, but return to the United States shortly thereafter. And while in the United States, their first child and Gerald's oldest brother would be born. Harold Gardner, who was born in 1870, and within 2 years of this growing family, they decided moving back to England was the best option. So they would move into a northwest town, a suburb of Liverpool, called, and I looked this one up, so I apologize to anyone who may know this town's proper name, Blundellsands in Lancashire. It was here that child number 2 would come into the world, and this was Robert, everyone called him Bob Gardner, and that was in 1874. Gerald, the star of our show tonight, came bouncing into the world Friday the 13th, interesting considering what he does in his life, of June of 1884. A 4th son would come into the world in 1886 by the name of Francis Douglas Gardner. Most of the time you'd call a kid Frank if he was born Francis, but they went by Douglas for the last one. And it was said that Gerald almost never saw his oldest brother Harold, which, considering there was a pretty good age difference there, that's not that surprising. Apparently, Harold would be at Oxford University studying law when Gerald was growing up. And the time frame of the memories for these guys were a little bit interesting because most of it comes from Gerald. Harold could have been as young as 16 or 17 studying law, or as old as 18, because the time frame was a little bit wonky in there. So he was at Oxford. Gerald grew up having asthma, which was not a good thing to have when you live in a cold, damp area like anywhere in England. And they had an Irish maid that was named Josephine Com McCombie, and Com would become the main person in Gerald's life. Over a very short window of time, Com took over, basically. And when I say took over, Gerald saw her more as a parent than he did his own parents. So, Com suggested eventually taking Gerald to a warmer climate, maybe alleviate the asthma a little bit that way. So in 1888, they would, and remember, Gerald's 4 at this point, and the family's like, here, take my kid out of the country. They would go to Nice in south of France. Really? And from there, they would wander around the Mediterranean for many years. In 1891, they would travel to the Canary Islands, then off to Accra in modern-day Ghana, and a trip to the Portuguese islands in Madeira, and they would actually stay in this island community for about 9 years, living in the town of Funchal, I believe is how that was said. They would return to England only in the summer, warmer months because of Gerald's condition. Apparently, and this is some family juicy gossip, Com, the nursemaid, nanny, etc., was quite the flirt. And when she was on these trips, taking Gerald along with her, it was less about Gerald's health and more about he's cute and he's cute. She was chasing tail. Gerald, because of her proclivities, would be left to wander unsupervised most of the time. Again, here, take my kid out of the country. We found out later that you were probably not the best option. These wanders that Gerald would do would introduce him to many people. He really wasn't a shy child, which is surprising. But he met a lot of people, and because of the amount of traveling he did at such a young age, he was introduced to a variety of cultures and ideas very young, which I think is healthy in a lot of ways. Maybe with some better role models, but that's beside the point. Gerald would learn about and become obsessed with weapons. It's a typical boy thing. And he collected many weapons, interestingly enough, from the Napoleonic Wars. That one was a little bit odd. Just interesting collection. He liked to display his finds on the hotel walls that they would stay in. I could not imagine how much luggage they had to tote around, honestly. Unfortunately, though, Gerald would never attend a formal school due to his illnesses and the massive amount of traveling they did. He would, over time, teach himself to read, and he read The Strand magazine, which was a British publication back in that time period. Interesting that he chose that to start reading, but he would devour many books once he learned to read, but he could never quite grasp the proper art of writing. He did write a lot, just wasn't that good at it. And it was during this time that he would read a book called There Is Not Death by Florence Marryat. And this was a book on spiritualism, which we have talked a lot about. And it was her version of how the afterlife existed, how we aren't just the physical meat suits we are here, but we change into something different. And this particular book really did change Gerald's opinions on how life occurred, which is, that can happen, especially when you read that kind of stuff really young. At the young age of 16 in 1900, Gerald's nanny/maid, Com, would marry one of the various suitors/conquests that she had chased. And this man owned a tea plantation in Sri Lanka. Like, you couldn't find someone more local. Nope, gotta move again. And this little tidbit was odd, and I'm assuming that Gerald had something to do with this part of it happening. The Gardner family, overall, agreed to let Gerald move with Com to the plantation and her new husband. They said they wanted him to learn the tea trade, but I also wonder if it wasn't Gerald's just like, I don't want to go back to you guys because I don't know you as family, so this is the direction he went. Which is possible, I guess. Gerald's father would, interestingly enough, go on to pay for his move and all of his training to become a proper tea planter. And this way he would learn the art of growing and taking care of tea trees, proper harvesting, and all of the assorted other ways of drying, roasting, aging, all of that stuff. Gerald would not enjoy the tedious act of the planting cycle because it's time consuming, obviously, but he loved to be outdoors. And that one I can 100% relate. I hate being inside, unless it's wintertime. Wintertime, leave me indoors. I don't like the cold. But summertime, I'd rather be outdoors. In 1904, So Gerald would be about 20 here. He would move out of the bungalow he shared with Com and her husband on the property and move into his own bungalow and start working for the nonpareil tea estate. In his spare time, he was out running around in local forests, of course, hiking, hunting, and he really enjoyed mingling with the locals. This would lead him to discover Buddhist theology, especially in Sri Lanka, and the concepts and practices of Buddhism, meditation, and etc. So this was kind of the first taste of his, or not taste, the first introduction to alternative religious beliefs for this young man. During the winter of 1904, in December to be exact, his parents and younger brother Douglas would come to visit Gerald in Sri Lanka. His father would seek to invest in a rubber plantation, which he would then have Gerald manage. Not sure how we went from tea to rubber, but okay. The plantation that he was investing in was known as the Atlanta Estate. Even though he was the manager of the estate, he had a great deal of free time. From what I could gather, the majority of his managerial duties was you do this, you do this, you do this, and morning meetings, evening check-ins, but he had the days kind of to do what he wanted, which fit with his personality over time. The free time was really good in one sense, obviously. It gave Gerald time to enjoy the Ceylon Planters I can't even read my own writing. The Ceylon Planters Rifle Corps in 1907. This was a group of local volunteer forces composed mainly of other European planters and plantation owners who had joined together to protect their tea and rubber crops against foreigners and the occasional local uprising. Locals weren't always grateful when the British moved in. They've got some names for that now, but back in the day it was just not something that was accepted. Later in 1907, Gerald would eventually return to his family in England, and during this particular visit, he would join the Legion of Frontiersmen to defend against the German invasion that was starting to build leading up to World War I. He would spend a lot of time with, during this one particular visit, he spent a lot of time with the black sheep of the family. The side of the family I'm speaking of was the Surgensons' side. They were Methodists, and during this time the Methodists were kind of still young. They weren't fully blossomed into the religion they are today, and the more Anglican side of the family was like, get the Methodists away from us, we don't want them, we don't like them. And there were some other things that went along with why the Surgensons were the black sheep. According to Gerald's memory, lore, and the memoir that he worked and had published at one point, the Surgensons believed in various aspects of the paranormal. Ted, the father of that branch of the family, had the belief that fairies were in his garden. Okay, kind of a common belief if you looked at England at this time. Ted would say he could feel them and sometimes hear them, but would also admit to people outside the family that it could have been just his imagination, or he just didn't want the neighbors thinking he was crazy when he talked to the flowers. Could be either way. Gerald also claimed that Ted told him a rumor about the patriarch of the family, Joseph. Gerald claimed that Ted said, a whole bunch of messes here, that Joseph was an active practicing witch when he was alive. It was said that Joseph had a mistress who had introduced him to the craft of the witch. Another lineage witch claim, which was made to help Gerald's practice later, because it was one of my ancestors was a witch, therefore I could be a witch, is how he would view it. And he also made a claim that one of his even further back ancestors. A woman, and I didn't catch her name, around 1610, that was burned at the stake because she was an active practicing witch. That particular claim, I tried to dig into it more, and I could not find any real evidence of that, so it could have been one of his tall tales, because he did do that on occasion. So true or not, I'll let you decide on that. But the one thing I've learned from my personal studies, and sometimes with some of these older authors, history would be stretched a bit to add some legitimacy to his practice, to their line. That being said, his later work, Gerald's work, of which I have one of his books right here, would stand the test of time. Wicca returned to the world and is here to stay, at least for, well, the foreseeable future anyway. And his line of witchcraft and Wicca has survived for almost 100 years, hiving off thousands of covens, starting many other lines, including Alex and Maxine Sanders, the Alexandrian line. All of this came back from Gerald Gardner, the person we're speaking of tonight. So, valid or not, something was there because it's still around. Back to our history lesson. Late in 1907, Gerald would return to Ceylon, so basically before 1908, but sometime late December. He kept looking into other spiritual beliefs and practices. And there wasn't a lot of detail that I could find. It was a lot of local tribesmen, and each tribe had their own version of Buddhism and tribal magic, so I'm sure it was a lot of that. In 1910, he would eventually be initiated into the Sphinx Lodge as an apprentice Freemason. The Sphinx Lodge, from what I can find, could have also been loosely tied to some of the Golden Dawn's origin lodges, but there wasn't a guaranteed solid fact there. There are just some loose associations. This lodge was affiliated, part of these associations, with the Irish Grand Lodge of Freemasons. This would take place in Gerald's I completely lost my spot, sorry. To attend the meetings, Gerald would have to walk around 15 miles to get to a train, where he would take the train into the city and go to the meetings. The meetings were at once a week, although there were some other stuff that would occur more frequently. And his dedication at this time was pretty intense, because he was walking 15 miles, according to him, one way to hop a train to go into town to be at this meeting at this lodge for up to 4 hours, ride the train back out, get off the train, walk 15 miles back to his house. That's a lot. That's an entire, 15 hours worth of traveling, basically. So it's possible, not saying it's not, that's just a lot. This part, though, was a little bit suspicious, because he received his initiation in 1910. But over the course of 2 months, he received the 2nd and 3rd degree titles. And that's really fast moving up. If you know or have looked into the Masons, Golden Dawn, a lot of these different groups, 1 degree is generally a minimum of 1 year. To bounce degrees that quickly sounds a little suspicious to me, but it didn't really matter that much. He achieved 3rd degree and resigned. Not kidding. He admitted that. It's in some of the records I found. And for someone so invested in this line of study to get a position like that, where you're starting to get into the authority levels, and then just walk away, struck me as a little bit weird. Speculation said he resigned because he was planning on leaving the country, but that's only speculation, because the lodge was associated with another lodge in England, so why wouldn't you just transfer your membership? That's the part that I said something was fishy there. He did eventually leave Ceylon and go back, and His father deemed the rubber plantation, the Atlanta estate, not a good investment and sell the property in 1911. And this would leave Gerald without a job. Still doesn't quite make me understand why he left the lodge. But he would eventually leave Ceylon for a short period. He moved back, though, to North Borneo, in the British-controlled section of Borneo, and he would get employment on a rubber plantation at the, I apologize, I have phonics here, we'll see how this works out, Mawo Estate, and this would not be a good job for the friendly and outgoing Gardner. The manager of this estate was a man, and they really didn't like this guy, because when they referenced him, they were not nice. None of the references I found to him were pleasant or nice. There was nothing positive said. This manager's name was R.J. Graham, and the biggest thing that was said was he was mean, he was very racist, and he was very spiteful of anyone who even dared question him. Settle down, Cupcake. You're just a manager on a plantation. You're not the owner. Graham wanted to destroy everything about the local land, deforest the entire place, burn it to the ground. He hated the locals. They were there strictly to work and to be beaten, and that was how he viewed them. That was not how Gerald ran. That's not how he existed, and per Gerald's personality, he made friends with a lot of the locals, especially the ones that lived out in the boonies, out in the woods, and a lot of people within the villages, and Graham was furious from what I saw. And Gerald, just being him, he got to know the locals really well, made friends, started to bond with them. He learned a lot about their original way of life before all of this chaos came in. And he would learn about local weapons. Of course he would. He loved weapons. One of which was a Sumpiton. Had no idea what this was, so I started looking it up, and it was one of the native blowguns between 18 and 36 inches. It was a way to hunt small animals and birds. Bigger animals, you could slow them down with the right poison, but you had to be careful not poisoning the meat, so there was an art to these things. And it was at this time, it is believed, there's not a solid record on when this happened, but historians believe it was during this time period that he received the snake and dragon tattoos on his forearms. Because when you see him in some of his pictures, he'd show them off. Kind of a cool idea, just so those are aware. This was a time period where your tattoo was done with a little flat stick with a needle on the end, and you tapped it. So you'd have the stick would be on one hand, and you'd tap it. Very painful, very time-consuming, old-school version of tattooing. So to have that much done, especially on your forearms, sounds a little painful to me. But tattoos were part of the local culture within the Dayak and Dusan people, and those were the ones in the area he was at. And he would tell his biographer many years later he attended many healing and seance type rituals in the Dusan people's villages. Again, really touching, getting curious about these different spiritual practices, which, like I said, leads us into his part 2. The tension, though, between Graham and Gerald would get worse as time progressed. I mean, it wasn't great to start with. And eventually Gerald would contract malaria, and Graham was like, "You're done, you're out." Gerald's like, "Peace, I'm out of here too." So he left Borneo, moved to the British Malaya, which is around Singapore now. Too much drama, too much illness, didn't want to put up with the nonsense anymore, and he bounced. You know, considering his life, I don't blame him. Once Gerald arrived in British Malaya, he took a job working as an assistant rubber plantation manager owned by the Borneo Company. while there, he decided to purchase his own land to supplement the income that he was making. And this was the land he purchased was being used as rubber plantations as well. And over time, he started off with about 450 acres is what I found. And by the time he kind of ended that section of his life, he had acquired over 600 acres because he kept picking up little pieces as they would become available. The other thing that I found is he tended to pay above market value to the people he was purchasing the land from, because it was usually the locals and he didn't want them to be basically stiffed on their value. So he was doing a kind of a good thing, and it was a pretty good investment when you think about it. I mean, he ended up with over 600 acres at one point. While he was in the British Malaya, Gerald met an American man, and I couldn't find out a lot about this guy except for his name, which was Cornwall. Cornwall was married to a local woman, and this is the one that I thought was a little interesting. He was a practicing Muslim, but he was practicing in a very unorthodox way. Like, how can you... Gerald found the weirdest people to hang out with. Just the way this was described in the research, and it was kind of like a footnote each time you'd run across it. So it was important, but it wasn't. So, the unorthodox we'll get into that in a second. Cornwall introduced Gerald to a lot of the locals when he moved to the British Malaya, which is Malaya, and that was not a bad thing. Saved Gerald the time of doing it himself. And Cornwall also introduced him to the concept and religion of Islam. And just so that Gerald could get a little bit deeper of a connection with the locals, he would make a confession of faith, which, okay, but he never practiced. It was like, yeah, I'm going to do this because I have a goal in mind. I really don't care about your religion, and that's how it was approached. That's how it was perceived, I should say. The introduction was a gateway to the magic and rituals of the local people for Gerald. That was his endgame. I want to know what these people do, want to know how they do it. Get me in. Cornwall's like, I can do that. Here you go. And Gerald's like, fine. So the magic and rituals of the local people, though, Gerald found fascinating. This really got his attention, especially the aspect of one of their ritual weapons. And that little weapon is this guy. It is a Chris knife, or a Karis knife, depending on who you hear it from. Chris is what we normally call it today. And this knife was used very heavily in the rituals of the local people in the British Malaya. So, little history on this guy, and then we'll get back to Gerald. This ritual blade is generally wavy according to the lore. There's a few straight ones where it's just a narrow blade. Majority of them have that little whoop-de-woo shape in the blade. And according to the lore, this represents a tool as a servant. This is not a tool as, this is just a tool. A Chris knife is given to one person, and then that person either passes it down to their children or is buried with them. This is a very personal ritual tool. They can be as long as 28 inches, as short as 12. A lot of modern day beliefs or thoughts about ritual knives is it's your elbow to the tip of your middle finger, just like your magic wand. So I think that's where the 12 to 28 inch thing came in. Not for sure on that. It could just be measurements. It's generally used today strictly ornamental purposes on ceremonial garb. Although I'm pretty sure if you went around behind the building, you still are using it for ritual purposes. They were generally seen as good luck symbols, especially when gifted. Some people say it was ill fate to be gifted one, though. I think those are people who just got burnt in the process. The blades traditionally were made of a minimum of 2 different metals. Each aspect of the blade and sheath were made to very, very specific standards. They looked cool and they're fun to add to a collection. And I did link a couple of ones you can check out down below. Where was that? A way to find out, though, if a crysknife that you acquired is a good fit for you, and this was one of the methods of finding out which one worked for you, which one didn't, is to sleep with it under your pillow. If you have good dreams or no dreams, then this is a good fit and you will bond with the weapon quite well. If you have nightmares or you toss and turn and just don't rest well, the blade is not vibing with you personally, and it's best to pass it on to someone else because it's not going to bring you the good luck that you would like it to bring. Let's just start there. At least according to the lore. And like I said, the links that I shared are their display versions, but at least give you an idea of what they look like. And if you do get something like that as a ritual knife, ritual knives and most Wiccan ceremonies are never used to cut. So that is something that I will point out real quick. Back to Gerald. We can take that off the screen. In 1915, Gardner joined a local militia group. With World War I in full swing, he decided it was time to return to Britain. And once he returned to Britain, he joined the Navy, or wanted to join the Navy. We'll put that in there. His health was still not that great, and so he was turned down for active duty, and he felt such loyalty to his country that he eventually found work as an orderly in a hospital to help with the effort of the war. But only a year later, Gerald's malaria that had went dormant popped back up, and he would have to leave Britain to go back to British Malaya in late 1916 or so. The warmer climates helped him regain his strength and put the malaria, interestingly enough, back in dormancy. I'm assuming there were some local medical people that helped with that. Gerald continued to manage the plantations for the different companies well after the war. But, and there's always a but, after 1921, because of the war not being as active as it was, profits from the plantations dropped off dramatically from what I was finding, and he was eventually let go by the Borneo Company. He searched around and was eventually hired by the government there to inspect rubber plantations, and this was an exciting job for him. Huge improvement, better pay, but it also meant he would be doing traveling all over the country. That thrilled him more than anything else did. But as we go up, we go back down. Gerald had his ill health that never recovered. I mean, from a very young child, he was always sickly in some form. And his ill health over time had his supervisors, plant him behind a desk. But this job, still at this time within the rubber world, was overseeing the sale and regulations concerning rubber business in that country, which was a big job, big paycheck raise as well. Not big, significant, I should say. This would lead to a sort of promotion overseeing another trade. I did not realize he had been around this, to be honest with you, although the time period, it's not that surprising. He would be in that area, put in charge of overseeing and monitoring the legal opium trade. I'm not kidding. And at the time, they thought that this particular product was safe and harmless, a way to deal with some illnesses, a little distraction on the side, no long-term consequences. Okay. And basically he was just monitoring its sale and distribution. Fine. It is speculated, though, that Gerald may have accepted a little money on the side, like it may slip you a little bit, and so that he would ignore the less than legal aspects of sale and distribution, i.e. international and illegal grows. Either way, in this particular time period, whether it was from under the table bribes or just above board, it was selling that well, Gerald amassed a pretty large fortune at this time. They said small, but when you think about where he was at and what he was doing, he was making good money at that point. That's actually not a bad thing. And the next part of his life, when he returns from here to Britain, we get into where he takes the occult and spiritualism exceptionally serious. Not just, that sounds fun, that's cool. He really gets into it. So we're going to end part 1 here. As I said, next Monday, we'll go back into this, and we'll start up with him returning to Britain, and we will move into really what developed into modern day Wicca. So we'll stop here. If you are interested in understanding a little bit more about his philosophies, ideas, concepts, this little book, and it's funny because the one I have was published by Magic Child. That publishing house went out in the 70s. Witchcraft Today by Gerald Gardner. This particular version that I have was forwarded by Margaret Murray, one of his trainees, and one of his one of his followers was Raymond Buckland, and he is a very fascinating person. But I'll talk about him later. But Witchcraft Today was probably one of the first books that I had picked up that was specific to this, outside of one other author. She happened to be trained under Buckland, so it's a direct line to Gardner. When I started really digging into him, it was really fascinating. The writing style, as I mentioned before, not the greatest. He edited it, and they helped him sort through a few things, but the majority of it's his own writing. It's more of a history book and kind of like how he came into the craft, things like that. So if it's something you're interested in, I did link that in the description. When we go into a deeper dive on the rest of his practices and beliefs next week, I'll talk about some of his other books, because I've read most of the stuff that I know that he wrote. There's a biography I haven't read yet, and I really want to, because I feel like this guy had a lot more access to stuff than what you can find other places. So I haven't read that yet, but the Witchcraft Today book, if you really wanted to understand more about how we got where we are today, this is the book to have. And the one that is linked, they've changed the cover a lot. I personally, I don't know why, I just like the simplicity of this one. So that's my opinion. But like I said, you can check that stuff out in the links in the description of the video. I will see you guys next Monday for part 2. And the rest of this week, I will be uploading the monthly readings for the elements, so you can check those out. On Friday the 2nd, look for a little extra video. This is not the normal readings. It's going to actually interrupt them, but it's something that I feel is important to discuss, so check out Friday if you haven't, or if you didn't think about it before. I'll let you guys go. I'm rambling now. So I will see you next week, and I will, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button, drop a like on the video, and I will see you in the next video.